Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First, I would like to thank Shlomit for inviting me to come present at this session. And while I only knew Sharon for a very short period of time, it was a great pleasure to have been able to work and excavate with her at ASOR. Destruction has played a vital role in many of the interpretations at the end of the Late Bronze Age in the southern Levant, and the end of Egyptian hegemony over the region is certainly no exception. Whether this is the destruction of Bet Shean, Tellmore, or Afek, each of these destruction events have played a strong, critical role in the interpretation of why Egyptian influence left these sites. However, despite the importance of these destruction events, they have yet to be examined under a critical model focused on the theory and interpretation of destruction events. In her paper, Anatomy of Destruction, Crisis Architecture, Termination Rituals, and the Fall of Canaanite ASOR, Sharon Zuckerman took a very first critical step into looking at destruction events, looking not only at the debris uncovered, but also at the social situation which led up to that destruction event. And it is with this work that I would like to then go on to look at 4 Egyptian sites, using it as my inspiration as well, and asking the question, was the destruction event the cause of the Egyptian withdrawal from the site, or is it only an archaeological marker of an already ongoing societal process? Now, before I go on to look at these 4 sites, I would like to present 3 very important points which Sharon contributed to the archaeology of destruction and which have greatly influenced me in my work in destruction. In her examination of the final destruction of the Late Bronze Age, ASOR, Dr. Zuckerman made these very important contributions to our understanding of destruction in archaeology. The first point is that destruction is not a single event, but rather it is the culmination of a social process which went on before it. Thus, to understand a destruction, we must look before it to truly comprehend it. Secondly, she noted that there are other causes for destruction than simply just saying it was by warfare, and that we should look for these other causes of destruction, even such as termination rituals. And lastly, she noted that at the time of writing, there was no systematic way of treating or discussing destruction events in the archaeological material. Now, while I can't touch on each of these subjects today, as I have been able to do elsewhere, I would like to use them as the starting point to go on to look at these 4 Egyptian sites. The first is a coastal site, Tel Gerasa, which was possibly the home of an Egyptian residence at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Now, the original excavator of the site, Zuckerman, found that his Late Bronze Age city was completely destroyed. However, this is the only information that we have about this destruction event. As he says, there was a conflagration, but he gives no other details about this destruction. Now, this information is then contrasted by the renewed excavations in the 1980s and 1990s by Herzog, who found no evidence of destruction. In both Areas A and Area C, he uncovered public buildings, one being the possible Egyptian residency, and in both of these, they were found to have been abandoned with no evidence of destruction. And moreover, in Area D, where there was a subsequent Iron Age reoccupation, he states, it was found that the latest Late Bronze Age stratum was abandoned as there are no traces of destruction by fire. So we then end up coming with a bit of a contradiction. The original excavator states the site was completely destroyed, and the renewed excavation found no evidence of destruction. The public building in Area C was completely emptied of all of its goods, and again, both the buildings in Area A and Area D were found to be abandoned with no evidence of destruction. And therefore, based on this information, I would suggest that it is likely we should classify this site as having no destruction, as we have no concrete evidence for an actual destruction event. And therefore, if we ask the question, was a destruction event the cause of a withdrawal of Egyptian influence from the site, the answer would then be no. The next site is Afek, which was the home of an Egyptian residence or garrison, again at the end of the Late Bronze Age, and stratum 12, this being Palace 6. Now, Palace 6 was completely destroyed around the end of the 13th century, most likely in an act of warfare, as 6 arrowheads were found distributed throughout the destruction layer. So when we come to the question asking, was this event the cause of the Egyptian withdrawal, the answer is most likely yes. After this destruction event, there is a withdrawal of Egyptian influence from the site. Palace 6 is abandoned, architecture changes, and then we also have a cessation of Egyptian material culture at the site. However, when we look before the destruction event, we find no evidence of crisis. We find no evidence of prior abandonment, and thus there is no clear other social marker which would explain why the Egyptian influence would have exited this site other than the destruction of Palace 6, most likely in an act of war. And therefore, we can then conclude that it is likely that the burning of Palace 6 resulted in the subsequent shift away from Egyptian influence back to the local Canaanite culture seen in stratum 11, and thus we can say the answer is most likely yes, this destruction event was the cause of withdrawal. The next site is Tellmore, another Egyptian coastal site. And for this one, we actually have 3 separate destruction events that we must consider. The first is the destruction event at the end of stratum 8 of building B, and this was attested to only by evidence of mud brick collapse. Building B was then subsequently rebuilt in stratum 7. However, building B was again destroyed, except this time again with evidence of mud brick collapse, but also with evidence of burning. Now, building B and Tellmore were then subsequently abandoned for a period of time as the structure was covered over by a layer of wind-blown sand, when in stratum 6, the site was then reoccupied by another Egyptian building in stratum 6, building F. However, this building too was destroyed in a mud brick collapse, much like stratum 8. Now, the question that we must ask then is, can we say what caused these 3 destruction events? And for both building B, stratum 8, and for building F, stratum 6, I would suggest that it was most likely a natural destruction, whether it is an earthquake, settling, storms, something of this nature, as we have no prior evidence of crisis, we have no evidence of human activity within these destruction events, we have no evidence of fire, and what would be more convincing to state why a natural destruction might be a cause is because both building F and building B were built on a foundation layer of sand, meaning that they were structurally not built on something very strong, which would have made them more susceptible to a natural destruction. Now, the problem is when we ask the question of the end of stratum 7, and here again, we don't have a lot of clear evidence, but we do have evidence of burning of this building. However, burning could have caused by either a natural event, it could have been accidental, or it could have been a human cause. And therefore, unless other information comes up, it is best to classify this destruction as an unknown cause. However, what is of great importance is that none of these 3 destruction events caused the withdrawal of Egyptian influence from the site, as building F was rebuilt in stratum 5, still with 12% of its ceramics material culture being in an Egyptian style. And moreover, building F was then not destroyed. It was, in fact, fell out of use and abandoned sometime in the mid-12th century BC with no evidence of destruction. So again, when we come back to the question, was a destruction event the cause of the withdrawal from the site? The answer is, again, most likely not, and it is more likely that the waning power of the Egyptian 20th dynasty in Canaan already in the mid-12th century BC simply led the site to be abandoned with this waning power. Now, the final site that I would like to present today is Bet Shean. However, Bet Shean is a little bit complicated, as the University of Pennsylvania expedition at the end of their level 6 made no recorded mention of finding any evidence of destruction. So if they did uncover evidence of destruction at the end of Egyptian occupation at the site, they made no mention of it. However, we do have some evidence of destruction coming out from the Hebrew excavations and then also from Yadin's excavations, both in Area S and in Yadin's Stratum 4. Now, both of these are domestic areas, and in Area S, Stratum S3A, it was uncovered evidence of a wide variety of types of destruction. In some rooms, we have just mud brick collapse with no evidence of burning. However, in other rooms, we have evidence for burning and for mud brick collapse, but this didn't happen the same in every single room throughout Area S. Now, Yadin also found similar evidence of destruction in his Stratum 4, again finding mud brick collapse and burning. Now, the traditional interpretation of this destruction event and then the subsequent withdrawal of Egyptian influence from the site is because of an attack by a local Canaanite population, either by perhaps from Tel Hahov or Pella, or even maybe some other unknown group of wandering people who might have destroyed Bet Shean. However, I would ask the question, is there not another interpretation for this destruction event? And I would like to suggest that indeed there is. There are several points of evidence which I would suggest lead not to the conclusion that this was a destruction by human activity, but rather that this was a destruction of natural activity. First, we have no evidence of human activity within this destruction, no evidence of warfare, and more importantly, there is no evidence of an attack against the symbols of Egyptian power at the site. Unlike the Egyptian monuments found at Chatzor, not only were the Egyptian monuments at Tel Bet Shean not mutilated, but they were placed in the northern temple in Stratum 5 by the local Canaanites in the following strata, suggesting rather a reverence for the Egyptian power or the memory of the Egyptians at the site, rather than there ever having been an intentional attempt at destroying these symbols of power. Moreover, in Area S, at the end of Stratum S3A, it was uncovered that they found several tilted and split walls. Now, this information, in conjunction that some rooms had only evidence of burning and collapse, while others had evidence of just mud brick collapse, is more an indicator of earthquake damage rather than damage by human activity. And finally, we know that this destruction event was a sudden destruction, as was uncovered by Yadin, as in one of his domestic buildings, he uncovered a set of grinding stones. Now, around the grinding stone, there was charred grain. In between the grinding stones, there was charred grain. And even stuck to the upper grinding stone, Yadin found charred grain, suggesting that this pair of grinding stones was in use at the time of this destruction event, suggesting a very sudden event which took this city by surprise. And therefore, with all of these points of evidence, I would suggest that it is not a destruction by human activity, but rather the end of Egyptian occupation at Bet Shean was caused, well, the destruction at least was caused by an earthquake. This then leads to the question again, was this destruction the cause of the Egyptian withdrawal from the site? And I would suggest that the answer is most likely not. It is more likely that it is an archaeological marker of an already ongoing societal process. By the mid to late 12th century BC, Egyptian power in Canaan had already waned, and even at Bet Shean, an area in south, building ND fell out of use with no evidence of destruction, perhaps already suggesting a process of abandonment at the site. And I would suggest that it is likely that even if this destruction event never took place, much like at Tel Geasa and Tellmore, the Egyptian influence at the site still would have left. It doesn't need to have a destruction event to explain its withdrawal. It is more that this destruction event is an archaeological marker that we can then say before there is Egyptian presence and after there is not. In conclusion, I asked the question at the beginning of this talk, Was the destruction event the cause of the Egyptian withdrawal from these 4 sites, or is it only an archaeological marker of an already ongoing societal process? And the results that we have are mixed. For both Tel Geasa and Tellmore, a destruction event does not appear to be the cause of Egyptian withdrawal. Rather, they were simply abandoned with no destruction. However, at Afek, the destruction event was most likely the cause of the withdrawal of the Egyptian presence from the site. However, when we move to Bet Shean, there is a destruction event, and after this destruction event, we do have the withdrawal of Egyptian influence from the site. However, I would suggest that this is more of a marker of an already ongoing societal process of Egyptian withdrawal from the southern Levant towards the end of the 12th century BC. As Sharon noted, to understand a destruction event, we must look before it. We must look at the social history of the site to truly comprehend the destruction. And when we look at these 4 sites, the social history is different at each site. And therefore, we cannot make the conclusion that making some overarching statement such as destruction was the cause of withdrawal of Egyptian influence from these sites. Rather, as with every single destruction event, we must look before at the growing societal problems before, or if there were no societal problems beforehand, and then to critically look at the evidence from the destruction itself, looking for what type of evidence there is for what type of destruction, much as Sharon did for the final destruction of the Late Bronze Age at Hatzor. Thank you.